Okay, this is what we call nostalgia. But what about the age cohort of the Russians who are between 18 and 24, who were born in 2000s, who didn't live a single day in the Soviet Union? They didn't live a single day even in the 1990s. So these are completely young people. They are younger than me, but they are more pro-Soviet. They, for example, have a better attitude towards Lenin, towards the Soviet Union in general. They are more pro-Soviet than the people who are between 30 and 50. So this is not nostalgia.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello there, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Our guest today is Ukrainian sociologist Volodymyr Ishchenko. Phil is going to be talking to him about his new book, Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War, and his dissection of the war and the underlying political crisis in Ukraine. Ishchenko stands out for asking key questions about such issues as class conflict in Ukraine, the role of the professional middle class, the presence of pro-Soviet attitudes in Ukraine and in other countries in the former Soviet space, and the way the post-Soviet era is marked by de-modernization. Now, before I hand you over to Phil, I just want to tell you a little bit about BungaCast if you're not familiar. We have a new episode out every Tuesday, and additional episodes are also out on Thursday or Friday most weeks. 2 episodes a month are free. The rest is available only in full at patreon.com/bungacast. So the first half of today's episode is going to be free across all podcast platforms, but to listen to the discussion in its entirety, you'll have to subscribe. Now, if you do join us at patreon.com/bungacast, you'll get exclusive episodes with our regular contributors, Alex Gurovich, Catherine Liu, Amber Ali Frost, and Lee Phillips. Also, episodes with writers and editors from Damage magazine with whom we're partnered. And if you also subscribe, you'll also get a free subscription to the magazine. And there's plenty from the Bunga Boys. That's Phil, George, and myself. Now, over the past month, just for instance, this is what you may have missed. Had Phil talking to Gregor Bashak about Germany's derangement at the end of history. Lee Phillips and myself talking to Korean sociologist Hae-young Woo about Korea's fertility crisis and gender wars. Fred Stafford gave us a brilliant explainer on how energy infrastructure works and why utilities matter. There were previews and reviews of Mexico's elections and the socio-political situation there, and a deep analysis of Indian politics with Achin Van Eyck. And also a tempestuous debate between the three of us on the Oscar winner Zone of Interest in the context of Holocaust films. Over the next month, we've got episodes on France's parliamentary elections and the rise of Le Pen. Of course, we'll be covering the UK's general election and whether Labour represents Tory continuity. The work of the late Dmitry Furman on post-Soviet Russia. That'll be in the reading club. The differences between Culture War 1.0 of the 1980s and today's. That's with Catherine Liu. And sociologist Eva Illouz on the emotions that motivate contemporary right-wing populism in Israel and beyond. Okay, now here is Philip talking to Volodymyr Ishchenko.
So today we're joined by Volodymyr Ishchenko, who's sociologist and researcher based at the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität of Berlin. And he's joining us to talk about his most recent book, which is published with Verso, Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War. So Volodymyr, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
And thank you for having me.
So we've been keen to have you on for a while now because myself and my other podcast hosts, Alex and George, they're not here for this chat today, but we've been reading the articles you've been writing and the blogs you've been posting on the course of the Ukraine war with interest for a while. So we're glad to finally have the opportunity to talk to you about your book. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to talk through some of the themes of the book, but also kind of pick up on what's happening with the war and also with the broader questions of politics in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet space, and so on. So I was wondering if we could just begin for the benefit of our listeners or listeners and viewers who may not be following the news about Ukraine particularly closely. What is the situation at the moment like in terms of the dynamics of the conflict, and where you think things stand at the moment in the conflict and in Ukrainian politics, and in particular, if there's anything which you think is important which isn't being picked up by the Anglophone media or press?
Well, I'm not exactly a military analyst, so that should be kept in mind in following whoever
Sure.
one might follow. My amateur understanding is that Russia has an upper hand right now, both military and also diplomatically. But the question is, of course, for how long it can be, and there are so many different factors that might interfere and change the course of the war, which has already happened several times, that I'm just careful about any predictions.
Yeah. And is there, I mean, so there's been kind of now and again stories come through about the political pressure that the Ukrainian leader Zelensky is under, efforts to change his military leadership, relations with Western leaders, and so on. Is there anything? Is the fact that Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield? Do you see that as leading to any possible political changes on the Ukrainian side or anything like that?
No, apparently there's a pressure to search for a solution, and apparently there is probably an understanding that previous strategies are not working. And as far as I understand, the whatever might be called the Western strategy about that, that's about launching a bigger military production that might be expected by 2025 or maybe later, and at the same time sustaining Ukraine. To which extent it might work, well, there are different opinions.
So I was wondering if we, as we do with all of our guests, so we always try to provide some background context. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about your personal background, and you also discuss it to some extent in the book as well. You call yourself, or you introduce the book by calling yourself a wrong Ukrainian, and in other contexts you talk about yourself as a Soviet Ukrainian. And part of the thrust of the book and the arguments you make is about the descent of Ukraine from the vision of Soviet modernity, and the fact that the options that lie before Ukraine at the moment, that none of them really offer as much as some of the more, I suppose, hopeful possibilities of modernization and modernity that were offered in the old Soviet model. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what does it mean to be a Soviet Ukrainian today, when the Soviet Union is so long gone.
Well, first of all, why run Ukrainian? That's obviously a reaction to the way how the dominant discourse about Ukraine is now framed, which tries to homogenize Ukrainians, basically presenting that there is just one view that is supposed to be a Ukrainian one, and which typically is totally adjusted with the policies and positions of the Western elites. And then when you articulate a different opinion, sometimes the opposite, sometimes simply not exactly the same, about the origins of the war, about the future of Ukraine, about what Russia is, to what the relation of the West towards Ukraine and towards Russia, about history. That's quite typically, I've encountered, and quite a few people who I know, it kind of like they don't have a right to claim such positions as Ukrainians. And
Yeah.
so basically, we are kind of like run Ukrainians. If it's quite difficult to claim that, for example, if I grew up in Ukraine and lived there until, well, very recently, I moved to Germany only in the end of 2019. And well, I worked in Ukraine. I studied in Ukraine. My parents are Ukrainians. I've been active in Ukrainian left-wing politics. I've been teaching at Ukrainian universities in Kiev, and then and at the same time, I sound not as a typical Ukrainian, not the one they pick up in the social media, or which are the typical people who comment for the biggest Western press, and 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 this kind of like provokes kind of like accusations. Are you really Ukrainian? Maybe you're a traitor. Maybe you're I don't know, you're fake, you're phony. But then that becomes kind of like funny, of course, in a certain way humiliating. In a certain way, it also requires to explain that Ukraine is actually quite a big country that includes a quite big diversity of opinions, and the histories of the different people, the different classes, the different social groups that legitimately have a different perspective on what's going on, including during the war, including about the causes of the war, including about the solutions for the war. And this should be understood as the complexity within Ukraine. And otherwise, that becomes kind of like a very orientalized and very colonial, in fact, very imperialistic view on Ukraine as some kind of like a homogeneous, well, primitive society where, well, just a few people could actually represent the opinions. But this is not so. And well, gradually, this is discovered. So much more complex topics are now picked up even by the mainstream U.S. or European press. For example, the most recent article in the New York Times is precisely about the people who avoid the draft to the army. Although the dominant narrative about the start of the war was that it's kind of like people's war. Every Ukrainian volunteers for the front. This is well, the existential fight for Ukraine. And then after actually 2 years, when that problem became very clearly apparent for Ukrainians themselves, where, well, it became widely discussed in social media. It became understood as a problem in the Ukrainian elite only, well, after a very long period of time. That's kind of like pick up. And well, that's the whole thing that requires an explanation. Why you run Ukrainian? This is as well, this is the state of the reality, and also the call to stop accepting it and starting to understand that the complexity of Ukraine and the various points of view that the people who hold Ukrainian passports might have right now, because these are the people who are in Crimea, who are in Donbass, who actually fight on the side of the Russian army against Ukraine. It's not a claim that there are many of them, but there are, and they are forcefully mobilized to fight for Russia.
Yeah.
And millions of Ukrainians who are actually in Russia, they've been there as citizens of the Soviet Union, and then most recently, and even before that, many Ukrainians came to work in Russia. And of course, in the last couple of years, the refugees. And before that, there were actually quite a big number of over 1 million of refugees from Donbass, the region where the war started in 2014. And then there are also millions of Ukrainians in the European Union as refugees, but also millions of those who moved there for work even before the war. And thinking also about that suppressed diversity, political diversity within Ukraine itself, which could be actually measured in the public opinion surveys, even despite the fact the reliability diminished. So understanding all this diversity of Ukrainians and Ukraine, this is essential. And this is so important to in the way how the whole discourse about the war and about Ukraine has been developing in the last couple of years. So this is a claim against this forced homogenization. And then, sorry for taking some time to explain this, but this is indeed
it's useful.
Important. And then about Soviet Ukrainians, that's a way to give, I think, a better understanding of that major cleavages within the post-Soviet Ukrainian politics. So quite typically, there are basically two typical discourses about the post-Soviet Ukrainian politics. One is that it was a cleft country, divided country. The eastern and western regions had different attitudes on almost every major issue of politics and history. Some people even try to analyze it as an almost like an ethnic conflict between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. The other narrative was that it's basically all this, all the narrative about the divided Ukraine is just a fake. That was simply a manipulation by the Ukrainian oligarchic elites that tried to mobilize the voters because they couldn't mobilize the voters with anything else. They were so greedy, rent-seeking oligarchs that could not provide any vision for Ukraine's development. And also Russia instrumentalized this division. So there is no actual social basis for any divide in Ukraine. So I think there was actually a social basis. It was not simply a political phenomenon. It was it did have social roots in the reality of the post-Soviet Ukrainian state. And those social roots go back to the Soviet Union, go back to the experience of the Soviet modernization, which you actually mentioned before, where in brief, a big part of Ukrainians, and perhaps even the most of Ukrainians, they acquired national consciousness within the Soviet Union. So for them, so we all, I mean, to the extent that the listeners had some basic social science course, the understanding of the modern roots of the nations, of nationalism, that actually in most cases, perhaps it was the nations which were created by nationalists and not the other way around. And so we need to look at the Ukrainian history, obviously not through the ethno-nationalist primordialist views that would try to trace it back to, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Although this is still a big deficiency of the school narratives, school book narratives about Ukraine, or quite many Ukrainian historians. And unfortunately, with the start of the war, those ethno-nationalist primordialist narratives became more present, even within the academia, where it would be not so just a few years ago. They are legitimized as decolonial turn and other things. So the reality is that before 1920s, most of Ukrainians in Russian Empire, in Galicia, which was the part of the Austria and Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, the situation was a bit different. But in Russian Empire, most of Ukrainians were illiterate peasants. They did not have national consciousness. And they understood themselves as peasants, for example, or as Christians, but not exactly as Ukrainians. And it's only in the 1920s, with the mass schooling introduced by Bolsheviks, which was one of the first things, one of the most important in the process of Soviet revolution, Soviet modernization, that the majority of Ukrainians started to understand themselves as Ukrainians, and with a very specific understanding, which was related to the Soviet revolution. So we were becoming Soviet and Ukrainians at the same time. And 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 this is the core of this claim about Soviet Ukrainians. This is how we become a nation, and
So one of the things that I
what is being destroyed uh, in the current years.
one of the things that I appreciated a lot about the book was your explanation of these kind of linguistic divisions that aren't so much ethnic, but as you say, to do with the kind of impact of mass education, mass schooling, urban-rural divides, and also education as something which is seen, or as Russian becoming the kind of language of education in the context of the Soviet Union, but also the fact that urban life in Ukraine during the early phase of the Soviet Union and during the Tsarist Empire, as you say, was Polish, Jewish, and Russian, and it was Ukrainian, or what's called Ukrainian today, was more the kind of Ukraine of the rural villages. All of that was it was very informative. I suppose, though, I'm still left wondering about this idea of Soviet Ukrainian, the idea of a Soviet Ukrainian. Are there other people who would think in similar terms, or is it a kind of a nostalgic idea? So there's, I know, like in the former Yugoslavia, when you do these kind of polls across the former countries of the former Yugoslavia, you see lots of people who will express kind of different kinds of nostalgia for the old Yugoslavia, at the same time as they will also express kind of starkly nationalistic views about other things that you ask them about. Or, I mean, I'm sure you know about the phenomenon of Ostalgie in Germany, a kind of a certain generational nostalgia or longing for things that were lost with the fall of East Germany. So, I mean, do you see Soviet Ukrainian as a kind of is it something which other people, other Ukrainians would recognize? Is it a kind of something by which you want to kind of cut into these debates in a critical fashion to draw attention to a history which is more complicated than that which presented, or does it have more of a political thrust? Can you kind of elaborate a bit more about how you understand the phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, in the way I use it in the book, it's more like an analytical concept. So, to capture this dual process of becoming national consciousness and also at the same time being participants of the Soviet modernization, becoming modern citizens as Soviet Ukrainians. So, that also has a critical political claim behind it. Because nowadays, the dominant narrative, at least in Ukraine, but also something that becomes uncritically accepted in the Western public sphere, in academia, is that the Soviet is something, is just external for Ukrainian history. It is something only imposed by Russians.
Yeah.
That the Soviet Ukraine doesn't have any root within Ukrainian history. It's just something, or it's understood as basically as an occupation regime.
Yeah.
In the quite typical narrative in the Central Eastern Europe of double occupation. So when the Nazis were then removed, but then the Soviets imposed their own occupation.
Yeah.
And kind of like a version of this narrative is now imposed on the Ukrainian. And this takes the public sphere, this takes the policies, the decommunization policies, removal of the Soviet legacy from the public space in Ukraine, renaming of the geographical objects, rewriting the history books, repression of the people who claim pro-Soviet views. So, and obviously when I say that there is something real behind this Soviet Ukrainian idea, and this is important to understand even contemporary Ukraine. Of course, this does have a political substance behind it. In the way, to which extent it still works as an identity. Well, in the 1990s, it did work as an identity. So in the polls, we could see, for example, then when they were asking about your primary identity in the 1990s, a minority, but not an insignificant minority. So over 10%, between 10 and 20%, obviously more in the early 90s, less later, they were claiming that their primary identity is a Soviet citizen. Those were mainly the older people.
Yeah.
So when I say the Soviet citizens, they truly were saying that they are primarily Soviet citizens, not Ukrainians, not Russians. So that was for them a true identity, a really important one. So yeah, there was, and the number of these people obviously declined, and now it's indeed a very, very, very small minority. But even until the full-scale invasion of 2022, a much bigger number of people in Ukraine were claiming basically that the Soviet Union was rather good than bad. And they were claiming, so for example, in 2021, this were over 40%, which is a lot. Understanding that, for example, the dehumanization policy started in 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution. So after like 7-8 years of dehumanization, you still have, well, if not a majority, then a very big minority, which is also reproduced through the generations who have a completely different perspective on the Soviet period. And even if they would not call themselves as, well, Soviet Ukrainians, even if that precise wording would not work for them as their primary identity, but their narrative, which was reproduced against and despite the state policies, was had a lot to do with the Soviet. And so again, the full-scale invasion starts. It becomes much more difficult to claim these things. But then even bigger complications. So you, for example, alluded that this has a lot to do with the nostalgia, which indeed was quite common in the former Eastern European countries, Ostalgie and Yugo nostalgia, and so on. Nowadays, we actually see, and this phenomenon is better visible in other post-Soviet countries, less in Ukraine. But I would still claim that it does exist in Ukraine. And so what I'm speaking about, that the youngest cohort of the post-Soviet people, they're becoming more pro-Soviet than the middle-aged citizens. So, for example, this was recorded in Russia in this year polls. So the most pro-Soviet citizens are the oldest one, right? And that could be explained as nostalgia. They had their better memories in the Soviet Union, and then they experienced post-Soviet collapse when they lost their pensions, when they, well, for many people, the whole life went into complete disaster. Okay, this is what we call nostalgia. But what about the age cohort of the Russians who are between 18 and 24, who were born in 2000s, who didn't live a single day in the Soviet Union? They didn't live a single day even in the 1990s. So these are completely young people. They are younger than me, but they are more pro-Soviet. They, for example, have a better attitude towards Lenin, towards the Soviet Union in general. They're more pro-Soviet than the people who are between 30 and 50. So this is not nostalgia.
So
or
how
otherwise
would you
extend that nostalgia as in a way that might not be actually meaningful? So I call it a neo-Soviet revival. This is a very new attitude. It is present in Belarus. It is present in Central Asia. And to a certain extent, it is even present in Ukraine.
So I suppose I guess the two questions. I want to kind of talk about the pre-war crisis presently, but two questions flow from that, from what you've just said. One is, I suppose I would like you've when you talk about yourself as the wrong Ukrainian, in the book, you talk about the fact that you were kind of educated and socialized in elite circles in Ukraine. And yet you were, you and others presumably were kind of excluded or ostracized from um, circles in which it was fashionable to hold certain kinds of pro-Western views or whatever it might be. And so I was wondering about if you can kind of explain what made you different to other kind of Ukrainians in those elite circles who were being educated and socialized in the same way. But then also, I wonder, like, this kind of neo-Soviet revival, how much of it is, like you say, it would stretch the concept of nostalgia to talk about it for this most recent cohort. But I suppose, I mean, in Russia, I wonder if it's, reflects the way in which the Putin regime has relied on the iconography and kind of Soviet-style mythologies of the Great Patriotic War to shore itself up. And so you have, that in the context of Russia, it's kind of a reflection of the attempt to build a new kind of Russian nationalism, which involves what the Great Patriotic War is part of that. Now, that wouldn't extend to Central Asia or to Ukraine, or maybe it does. But I'd be curious to hear, how would you explain that? How do you explain the neo-Soviet revival? And how would you counter kind of arguments that it's a byproduct of authoritarian state development?
Okay, these are two different questions, and so maybe we'll get back to the second one. Let me first explain about myself. So if you read in the book that, or at least you understood in the book that I'm coming from elite circles, it's a misunderstanding, in fact. So of course it depends on the way how you interpret elite, but my family was at most intellectual elite, cultural elite. Technical intelligentsia. Nobody in my family had ever had any high position in the Soviet Union. We were nobody among my relatives was in nomenclatura, in that top communist elite. Some were Communist Party members, but okay, that was like one of the biggest parties in the human history, where millions of Soviet citizens were party members, but they were not in the elite. And then in the 1990s, we were on average a bit better than an average Ukrainian surviving the 90s, but not exactly in the elite in terms of politics or economy. And in terms of, in comparison to the, Western middle class life standards, we were like far behind. So we didn't have our own car, for example. We didn't have our own like summer house. I've got some kind of like a personal computer only when I was a student. So in fact, quite late, and so it was with certain peculiarities that was a family history of Soviet intelligentsia. Who were not exactly political during the Soviet Union. And in the post-Soviet period, my parents were also not really political. And they were not left-wing. So again, to explain that what I'm trying to argue about Soviet Ukrainians is not some kind of like personal nostalgia for the Soviet period. My parents, in political terms, they went quite far to the right, very further than me. And so my political development was not exactly simply some uncritical take from the parents or whatever. And so, for example, the reading circle of the Soviet intelligentsia was important for me, and the Soviet science fiction, which was quite different, for example, from the Western science fiction, and which was more humanistic, was more utopian, and put quite complicated social and ethical questions, and that was very inspiring. Then, of course, there was also the kind of like rebellion, resistance against the prospects that I felt that I might take, and the very limited prospects to be to develop as a professional, to take kind of like the job I would like to pursue, and vaguely this was understood that it might have something to do with history, with social science, but at the same time the fears of my parents. If you enter, for example, the history department, the university, who are you going to be? Who are you going to where are you going to work? Are you going to work for like some miserable wages as most of Ukrainian scientists and scholars worked in the 1990s and 2000 and still now? And my wage at the Ukrainian universities was just it was just ridiculous. In fact, it was always the need to look for other jobs. So that's definitely not an elite experience, and not a nostalgia. For me, the left-hand youth, the communist youth, the pro-Soviet youth will always have to do with a forward-looking project. And nowadays, we actually see the scale of the crisis the whole world is experiencing now in society, in politics, in environment. Polycrisis is how Adam Tooze calls it, which requires radical solutions, which requires coming back to the idea of social revolution. And this is where our Soviet experience, anything that might be called neo-Soviet, can a lot to contribute, because we experience this crisis perhaps as nobody else in the world. The depths of our disintegration, how early it started, how there was this collective understanding that the future does not exist. There is no future. It's only stagnation. It's only becoming worse. And that's a feeling that many people acquired in many parts of the world. Recently, after COVID, after 9/11, after Brexit, after Trump, in the post-Soviet countries, this started even before the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So that's to explain it. And and please don't see me as a kind of like an elite kind of guy with some weird ideas. No, I think what I'm trying to argue, it's come organically from the experience of people like me.
No, I'm glad to be corrected on any misapprehension.
Sorry, because this is so important.
No, absolutely. I understood from your book, like you say, about the kind of background of your parents. I was kind of thinking more specifically about how you describe the slow freezing out of those people like yourself who didn't have the right opinions and who are slowly kind of frozen out of polite company, I suppose, as you'd say over here, or out of kind of public discussion of certain kinds of topics.
The second question.
Yes.
Whether the neo-Soviet revival is simply some kind of like
an artifact. Yeah, because we've discussed this with some others, and it left me wondering if it's kind of an effect of all the military parades on Red Square under Putin, if it's partly an artifact of that.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's definitely much more complex than this. So first, it's not only in Russia, in Belarus, in Central Asia. You see the growing number of young people who are pro-Soviet. In Georgia, for example, which is actually not in exactly good relations with Russia and had an experience of Russian attack in 2008 and parts of the country which are not under the control of the Georgian government, dependent of Russia. And so we still see the pro-Soviet attitudes are strong and maybe even rising. So this international comparison would disprove it. Secondly, it's not simply about Stalin or the victory in the Second World War, but what about Lenin? That's the survey from this year was specifically conducted before the anniversary of Lenin's birth, April 22nd, and Lenin is not exactly a positive figure in Putin's speeches. This is the person who he personally blames him for the fact that Ukraine is an independent state and not a part of Russia anymore. And when the young Russians say that Lenin was actually a great leader for our country, that does not come so like straightforwardly from the official discourse. And I think this is much more actually a resistance, a rejection of the post-Soviet reality, not the, well, simply something like an effect of elite manipulation. And it does have authoritarian part of that. It also has a social critical part of it, because the Soviet Union was in certain respects better than their current reality. And then it becomes kind of like a criticism of the state where they live. And if they go back, that means that the 30 years of post-Soviet experience, they did not give them something positive to stick their identity to. And for that, they need to come back to the older period. And it is not exactly nostalgia. It is not exactly just because when the people say that the Soviet Union was rather better than worse, it doesn't mean that they would support just some mechanical resurrection of the Soviet Union. Most of them understand that it's simply not possible, and it won't be possible. But this is still some presence of the idea, of the social critical idea, and this might contain some core, some very important elements for the future forward-looking social revolutionary project. Perhaps in the same way as, for example, as the French Revolution of 1789 was important for Bolsheviks in 1917, as symbolism, as some understanding, some concepts to understand the reality. The future revolution might, in the same way, might refer to the Soviet Revolution, not mechanically, not dogmatically, but still in some important ways going back to that experience, because that was a very important experience that still needs to be reflected.
So that takes us to the question of these kind of earlier social upheavals, and you discuss, you talk about whether or not it's useful to think of the kind of cycle of uprising, of popular revolts and uprisings in Ukraine, including the Maidan in 2014. How useful it is to think of that as in terms of this idea of passive revolution. And just before that, though, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the characterizations you give of some of the kind of issues coming out of the conflict. And one thing that I could not help but be struck by was when you describe the kind of the conflict, or some of the cultural aspects of this conflict between the kind of modernizing, youthful, middle-class Ukrainians and provincial Ukrainians, or Ukrainians in the southeast or in the east, and just how far, just even the terms you use, how far it would seem to mirror other kind of divisions elsewhere in the world, very distant from Ukraine in very different contexts. So you talk about, for instance, you use the term the professional middle classes to kind of discuss this kind of Western-oriented layers of Ukrainian kind of aspirational kind of youth, I suppose, who would like Ukraine to join the European Union, who are educated, whose careers perhaps are around the NGOs, and you call them the professional middle class, and how on the other side, more working class, poor, more rural Ukrainians are castigated as kind of being somewhat backward, having the wrong views, unfashionable, primitive, uneducated. And this kind of division, you could, even using the same language that you use in the book to talk about this division in Ukraine, could be used to talk about divisions in Britain, over people who voted for Brexit and people who support the European Union. It could be used to talk about the people in kind of in the US Midwest who voted for Trump in kind of Rust Belt constituencies, and the kind of West Coast and East Coast kind of middle classes who've voted Democrat and opposed Trump. And I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that this kind of conflict seemed to transplant itself to these very, very easily to these different contexts. And it's something on this podcast we've received quite a bit of criticism for talking about the professional middle classes, because the PMC, because people say, well, it doesn't kind of sit easily with the kind of classes of classical social theory, not least Marxian social categories. It doesn't easily fit with them. You attribute them, you give them too much kind of agency and influence. It's really they're kind of adjuncts or auxiliaries or at best, and you overemphasize their role. And so I was completely fascinated to see that you're willing to give them significant kind of political prominence in your story about the political upheavals prior to the invasion in 2022, and indeed in the kind of during the first kind of round of Russian military intervention from 2014. So I was wondering if we could begin by talking about the pre-war crisis. If you could just tell us a bit about how you see the role of the PMC in Ukrainian politics and society.
Well, that's a great question and very big. And just comment on the way how you've seen a lot of similarities between Ukraine and other countries, Britain. I would certainly say also about Central Eastern Europe, perhaps in a certain extent also the Western Europe, the way how the discussion about who votes for populists, who vote for the far right, and so on, how this develops. It does have very important similarities, and that's one of the most important claims in the book, that we need to look at Ukraine not as some very exceptional story. It's just small nation attacked by the dictator in the neighborhood, and it's all about those complicated relations between Ukrainians and Russians that should go back to the history of the Russian Empire and all those particularities, Western and Eastern Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. No, it's there is some political and ethical rationale behind building an exceptionalist story about Ukraine, because it's may work for mobilization and so on, but it's certainly a very poor analytical narrative. We need to look at Ukraine as certainly an element of much broader processes, and that cleavage, which is so little discussed, but it's so important, between the classes in Ukraine, and the basic empirical fact that the professional middle classes were disproportionately in the pro-Western camp of Ukrainian politics, disproportionately present in the Maidan revolutions in 2004, in 2014, and which is simply just established by the systematic measurement of those who participated, those who supported the revolution, those who supported the post-revolutionary reforms. These are professional middle classes. Those the people who acquired, in particular, because of the Euromaidan revolution, disproportionate influence on Ukrainian politics, despite there being not exactly a majority in the society, obviously a minority, but a minority which was supported by the West, which was organized, at least to the extent, in quite disintegrated and weakly organized Ukrainian civil society. These were the groups organized in NGOs which had a disproportionate influence. Also, via their alliance with the transnational capital and with the Western institutions. So that typically was described as a sandwich model of influencing the policies in Ukraine. The local professional middle class civil society identifies an issue. Typically, this was about corruption, a way to kind of like charge and claim about some selective benefits this or that oligarch had thanks to privileged access to the state. And then the pressure was coming from the West. yeah, well, sometimes very brutally calls from Vice President Joe Biden. He was a vice president until 2016, and according to himself, he spent like thousands of hours speaking to our previous president Petro Poroshenko. Sometimes making quite clear things what Ukraine should do and what it should not do. Or the conditionalities of the IMF, or the very explicit statements from the G7 ambassadors in Ukraine. So there was a number of these connections between the professional middle classes and the way they started to influence politics after the Euromaidan. But to the extent, it's also important to understand that they did have distinct interests, which were connected with the making Ukraine deeper integrated into the Western economy and politics, in the interest of transnational capital, articulated against the interests of the local oligarchs, or I prefer to call them political capitalists. So the interest of the professional middle class were deeply connected with the pro-Western integration of Ukraine. Why? Precisely because, and it does have a lot to do with all those complicated social science discussions about whether professional middle class even exists. But these kind of people were directly benefiting from the pro-Western integration as professionally, economically, politically. And so their disproportionate presence and the kind of policies, pretty neoliberal, which they were promoting via Ukrainian civil society allied with Western institutions, they were in the specific interests of this minority group. Then, of course, it might be we may start very complicated Marxian discussions whether middle class is an actual class, but this group, and I would still use the term class, it did have distinct interests which they have been empowered to push on the Ukrainian politics, and which were not representing the interest of the majority of Ukrainian population. And this was also very clearly seen in many public opinion surveys. The kind of reforms that the middle class civil society were imposing on the government, were in many cases they were not supported by the Ukrainian majority.
So it's very useful and clarifying. I think one other element that I particularly appreciated was also the way in which you deflate some of these. I think kind of you say these exaggerated claims about the influence of neo-Nazis and the far right on the Ukrainian state as it's emerged from 2014 and the war. And I think many leftist critics of NATO and of the Western support for Ukraine have been very keen to flag up the fascist. The fascist links of the Ukrainian military, or to draw attention to the neo-Nazi background of Azov. And, these photos will pop up on social media of Ukrainian soldiers or fighters in some of these far-right battalions covered with kind of Nazi tattoos, or with the with meetings with swastikas in the background and so on. And so I found it very useful, and again, kind of interesting, the way in which you offer a very measured account of the role and influence of the far right in Maidan, and also in Ukrainian politics since. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the things that you mentioned, they're actual facts. And still quite many people do not appreciate those facts to the extent that for example, the Nazi symbolism became normalized in Ukraine. Well, you mentioned the exaggerations of one kind, typically coming from the left circles, from anti-American circles. There are also, the opposite exaggerations. That nothing that you mentioned is is true. It's simply fake news. It's simply Russian propaganda. Of course not.
Yeah.
These are the facts. It's just proven facts. But that of course requires be more precise. What exactly was the far right in Ukraine and the radical nationalists? And the thing that I always been trying to emphasize that these kind of parties, they didn't have large electoral support. Although it was not insignificant. For example, in 2012, the radical nationalist far-right party Svoboda, which means freedom in Ukrainian, which at that moment was modeling itself. Their role model was the Le Pen's party in France. Le Pen also changed the names of their party several times. I think at that moment it was called National Front. Now it's National Assembly or National Rally. I'm not sure how it's precisely translated from French.
Yeah, National Rally, yeah.
Rally, right. Again, that was also the history of rebranding of that party. And Svoboda was actually a rebranded name from the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine, which was very explicitly had Nazi, very explicit Nazi associations. So in 2012, they got over 10% of Ukrainian votes in the national elections, and they were actually winning majorities in several Western Ukrainian regions, and they were the biggest fraction in the local councils there. So that was not a marginal party, right? But the even bigger impact was, but okay, of course, then you would say that 10% is not, well, Le Pen might probably win the elections in 2 weeks in France. At least many people worry about that. 10% is obviously smaller, and after the Euromaidan revolution, the far-right parties were not capable to repeat that electoral success. And in the last elections that we had in 2019, the far-right bloc got just over 2%. And that becomes kind of like just a killing argument of the liberal part of the discussion that just the neo-Nazis are simply the just fake phenomenon and nothing to worry about. But they were actually much more important, not in electoral politics, but in extra-parliamentary politics. As some of the most organized groups in the civil society with thousands of ideological militant activists, which had historical tradition going back to the Nazi collaborants in the 1930s and 1940s, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, ideology, revolutionary nationalism. They were perceiving, for example, the whole post-Soviet Ukrainian period as simply not real Ukraine, as a regime of internal occupation, which replaced the external occupation during the Soviet Union. And so they perceived us as revolutionaries against that post-Soviet regime. And also the presence of and the importance of violent skills. They were training themselves since 1990s to wage. Basically, in a certain extent, they were kind of like prophetic. Because in the 1990s, they started to establish the organizations that were supposed to rebuke the Russian invasion. So they were thinking that Russia is going to attack. And so they need the organizations that would be capable to fight against Russians in a guerrilla war, maybe in a conventional war. And then it's kind of like worked out. So when the politics in Ukraine in the 1990s and 2000s was very peaceful, nothing in comparison, for example, to the very contentious and sometimes very violent politics in France, Gilets jaunes or the riots by migrant youth, nothing to the, riots during BLM in the United States or the riots in Britain, in other Western European countries. So nothing like that was happening in Ukraine until 2014. So that was an extraordinary peaceful period of 25 post-Soviet years. But when the actual violence started, the radical nationalists were the best prepared for it. And so this is why they took such a prominent position in the Euromaidan revolution, even though they were indeed a small minority of the protesters. But when the violence escalated, they were at the front lines. And then they became the symbols of the revolution. And then in the post-Euromaidan politics of Ukraine, they were actually capable to blackmail the government with violence, sending threats to, for example, to President Zelensky, again warning him against implementing the Minsk Accords, which they perceived as the capitulation to Russia. The Minsk agreements were the agreements which were signed between Ukraine, Russia, and with some mediation from France and Germany, supposedly to stop Donbass war, but they have never been implemented. Just a footnote. And so the radical nationalists were an important radical win, violent win of the pro-Western camp. And then it also becomes quite interesting discussion because, in the Western and also Eastern European context, we think about the far right as basically anti-Western, anti-EU, Eurosceptical, anti-American. Most recently, also, many of those parties and movements and politicians are accused of being pro-Russian. Think about Viktor Orban in Hungary. And in this context, Ukraine looks kind of like an exception. The far-right groups and parties were anti-Russian. And not simply anti-Russian, but also constantly aligned themselves with the pro-EU, pro-US camp. Even when they had some reservations about that and saying that, okay, we need not that liberal Europe of LGBT parades, but the true white Europe. Still, in the real politics, they were always with that professional middle class. And serving as a kind of as a radical wing to that politics. So that looks like an exception. But it does not necessarily make the pro-Western camp and the allied radical nationalists any way better. If you look closely at the strategy, at the ideologies of those Ukrainian radical nationalist groups and parties, they were significantly more extremist than the typical far right in the Western Europe, in terms of having very not revising their attitudes towards the 1930s and just literally modeling themselves on the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which in the 1930s context was a way to establish a Ukrainian fascist party. And this was exactly the way how the ideologists understood themselves. And then obviously the period of collaboration with Nazis, which ended, but still that was a very important part of the story. And also, not simply ideologically, but also in their current politics, the way how they were ready to use violence.
If I can just interrupt you, Volodymyr, your mic is scraping a bit. It's okay if you maybe just pull it out a bit, or maybe I think it might be
simply.
It might be. It comes. I think it was moved when you're moving your arms. I think it was brushing against the cloth. So.
Okay. Yeah. So the extent of their radicalism was more significant than the typical Western European far right, and that's also quite often misunderstood or downplayed.
Yeah.
Hi there, sorry to interrupt, this is Alex here, but that is the end of the free episode. We hope you'd like to listen to the thing in its entirety. That's at patreon.com/bungacast, and we hope to see you there.